Welcome to this episode of On Emergence. And today I am really excited to finally have Zach Siegel here in front of me, finally recording. We had to reschedule a number of times. Those of you who are watching, we're located here in Peru, in Pisac, a small, tiny village in the Sacred Valley of the Incas, which is where we met. We were introduced by mutual friend Stephanie, who also was on this podcast before. So Zach is a grief counselor. He is a former principal of a secondary school in San Francisco. He is also a medicine worker of the Peruvian Amazonian lineage. And today we're going to cover a number of topics, and one of them that stands out to me personally the most is grief. I've been very fortunate to be in this very room about a week and a half ago to be part of the grief ritual that Zach has held for the community here in Pisac. And I have a special relationship with grief because certainly, I lost my father about 5 years ago. So there's kind of like that relationship with grief started emanating from that space. And there are a number of things like grief about the dream that never came to be. And yeah, grief is a friend that I thought I knew quite well. But having met you and getting acquainted with your work, it just took it to another level. So I'm excited to have you here. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation. It's beautiful.
I wanted to do your own introduction because I don't think I quite did the justice and I quite shone the light on all the work and all the experiences that led you here, right, on the sofa in Peru, in Pisac.
Yeah, I started education about a decade ago, a little bit more than a decade ago. Can't believe it's been that long. I can't believe I can even say it's been a decade. It really just felt like last year that on a whim, I decided to quit my position in New York City and start education. I'd been traveling around, living in different places in my early 20s to see where I really wanted to get settled. I did a stint in West Africa, in Mali. We were going to work with the Dogon people, a tribe in central Mali in the Sahel. However, as we were embarking to leave, Gaddafi's armies had marched on from Libya, expelling almost everyone who was non-Muslim from Mali at the time. And so that dream ended really quickly. And we were flung back over the sea, and we landed, a group of my friends. We linked up in college, and we had formed an intentional community in college. And we ended up in North Manchester, Indiana, with a 400-acre farm with virtually no experience and no funding. Idealistic, young 20-year-olds, 21-year-olds. And after a bit of time with that, I decided that I wanted to go to New York City.
After being so just to get the timeline clear, because I didn't know that part. So basically, you had to escape West Africa because of the Gaddafi regime. You flew and you were a farmer for a while, and then you're like, I'm gonna go to New York City now.
Yeah, my first job out of college was actually, I was a pig farmer.
Okay, wow.
And it was this dream that we had been building since college. I went to a very conservative evangelical school where I studied theology and history. And my friends and I were sort of the rebel anarchists on campus, and we quickly diverged from the accepted doctrine of both the university and the church organization that we were part of. It felt like actually being in Berkeley in the 1960s, where like the administration and the faculty were like kind of conservative, and there were some faculty members that were like secretly progressive, and the student body largely was progressive, or like sort of like getting out of that line of ideology. And my friends, there were like 40 of us on campus who just like wreaked havoc for like the 4 years that we were there. We staged protests, we created zines and leaflets, and we organized different like organizations. We had a community garden project that we started my freshman year there, and we spent 4 years building a community garden. And the garden really centered everyone, at least in my friend group. And there were I think there were about 12 or 14 of us that became like really good friends. And we worked in Palestine for a little bit on a very small stint. I had 2 friends that were journalists there. And I went to go over for 6-8 weeks to be with them 1 year. And then right around junior year, we started traveling pretty heavily back and forth to West Africa. First to Togo and then to Mali. The original idea, sort of like way back when, was to be sort of like missionaries. And that quickly devolved because our political ideology and cultural ideology was realigning. And so by the time that we were like committed to going to live in West Africa, we were not missionaries by any means. We were like pretty anti-missionary work at this point.
But that was still like a disguise that you went under? Or
No,
like you did
no. Well, we never actually made it to get there. This was always, it was just in the plan and in the working. Of course, we had traveled back and forth a lot of times, logistics and setup. But we were gonna run like a nonprofit organization. Basically, we were again really young and idealistic and had no idea what we were doing. We were just like, we want to help. And in reality, all of us knew that we were actually the ones that were receiving more wisdom from the indigenous tribe.
How so?
It was just a shock to our culture. Most of us grew up in middle-class, Southern evangelical households. I was the exception. I did not. I grew up in a very poor family in New Jersey. And I have a different story of how I ended up in the church because I was not raised really in the church. But most of my friends were like upper middle class, white students that had never like really been outside of the United States before, and certainly had never encountered indigenous wisdom traditions. And so this was my first stint in indigenous wisdom traditions, where eventually the grief rituals emanated from. Actually, I didn't know this at the time, but it was only a tribe that was a few hundred miles south called the Dagara, people of Burkina Faso. Yeah, I trailed off a little bit on this one.
That's okay.
We were in the introductions.
Yes,
I just went into my life
I
history.
think it's just generally how our conversations go, so it's fine. I think I'll either edit or like viewers will get to experience what Zach
Great.
and Laura are.
Great. Okay, good.
Just on the podcast. So I wonder, to kind of get back a little bit into the trail of our conversation, is that my question is like where that relationship with grief started developing. Is it something that you mentioned that there were some grief rituals in your when you would spend some time in West Africa among the tribe, on the Dogon tribe, or was it earlier? Is it a thing? Because I remember you also mentioned during the grief ritual is that as a child there was some sort of sensation around that feeling.
Yeah, grief has always been very close to me. There's a German word that encaptured this. The meaning of it is like the one who carries the burdens of the world. It's generally depicted with like an old man with a big backpack on his shoulders, and he's just kind of like hunched over walking around. And I've even noticed this in my somatic body. My somatic body tends to be a little bit more like concaved. And I've had glimpses of this weight in ceremonies with the ayahuasca and other entheogenic plant medicines. Yeah, and it's always been with me. I remember feeling a lot of grief when I was really young. I remember a distinct memory when I must have been like just a couple of years old, and it was my birthday. And I remember looking around at my family system and being like, what happened here? Like, why, this is not what family is. And I remember there was a lot of alcohol in my family. There was a lot of love, but also a lot of substance abuse. There was a lot of repressed emotions. There also was a lot of joy. I mean, it was all the things, right? And kind of being this convoluted family system of both like love and like total terror of like, this was not what I signed up for. I had a very distinct feeling when I was a child of like, I don't know if I signed up for this. I always pictured, and family's always been a value that's been really close to my heart. And yeah, so my second or third birthday, I remember just like grabbing a blanket, grabbing a Greek mythology book, going into a closet, locking myself in with the cats. And no one could find me. They couldn't find me. My mom called like missing child services, and
Oh my God.
the family was like running around the neighborhood trying to find me.
And you were in the house.
I was in the house. I had locked myself in the closet, and I was just reading Greek mythology. And the stories of the mythos of the Greeks really struck something very early in me that has never really left. I've always been a student in mythology. By the time I was 5, I was like going to the library by myself. I might have watched Matilda, and this might give me the courage to do this, but I would go to the library and just study Greek and really had a kick out of it. I thought it was really fun.
5-year-old, you were going to the library to study Greek.
Yeah.
Awesome.
I also picked up the calculus book, but I quickly put that one down.
Well, it does have a bit of Greek, like the letters.
Exactly, yeah.
Why myths?
Why myths?
Yeah,
That's a great question.
What is it in myths that called you as an adult that you now understand, perhaps?
Yeah, I'm again reconnecting with mythology in a deeper way. Myths are a form of truth. I think one of the limitations of Western consciousness and Western thought is that we pigeonhole truth to be just empirical truth. Things that can be measured, observed, dissected, parceled out. We consider all of those material, observational, rational truths as like the highest form of truth. But there's lots of other forms of truth that I think we ignore. There is the truth of direct experience that each person has in a different perspective and different experience in their own life, certainly subjective. There's symbolic truth. There's truth that's outside of facts and literalism. Oh, this is a fun diatribe. So the truth that Westerners uphold most fervently is literal truth. And we consider anything that's not literal truth to be not true. Literal truth is this concept that really comes with literacy, right? It is the written word. It's when we start writing down things that we get this concept of literal truth, because it's the truth that is written down. It's kind of what like constitutional scholars do. The Supreme Court justices are generally like arbiters of literal constitutional reality. So they're sitting down with the Constitution and being like, okay, given the context of America in 1770, 70 to 80s, and the text that's right here in front of us, what do we literally believe that the founders intended here, right? It's the same way that we read the Bible.
Then it opens all sorts of like roads to interpretation.
It does, but like there's still this, you're getting back to the text, and you can argue about literal truth in the text. What does the text extrapolate? What's the hermeneutics or epistemology of these words, or what's historical context around it? But it really gets to this, like by the mid 1700s, you like get this very like rational, scientific, material understanding of things, because there's this reaction to the Catholic Church. Europe is coming out of the 100 Years' War. There's been a century of violence and bloodshed, basically over arguing about fine minutia in the text. And so scientists at that point, a material like rationalist, this is Descartes, Bacon, etc. They essentially assert that like, okay, we need to just be able to find what is factually true, because there's so much subjectivity. It's led to a huge collective traumas like the 100 Years' War.
The perception of literal truths. The only truth that we have is the literal one, whereas it's compared to myths, and then the tales that are shared, like here,
Totally.
or in sense, like compared to Central American myths or Greek myths, or my favorite is Scandinavian mythology. Actually.
Like Norse mythology.
Oh, I
Yeah.
love it.
I'm reading a really good book called The Witch's Heart, and it's about Loki's wife, Abagorda. I'm not saying that right, but it's a really fascinating fiction book.
I
North
love
mythology.
Scandinavia. For me, it's always in Scandinavia. Like Greek mythology was something that I really like. I loved. That was my gateway into mythology.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it's like there's something that's so fascinating. It was so different because I think I was exposed to Roman mythology as well, and I was like, those guys just like stole it.
Yeah, totally.
But there were certain things that just were like very, very extremely, of course, unique to Scandinavian myth that resonated. But yes.
Yeah, they're the only gods that, and they're not the only, but in at least the European pantheon of gods, they die. Those gods die. Where like Greek and Roman, Egyptian mythologies the gods are immortal. But in Norse mythology, the gods die. which is really fascinating.
I think that was the Ragnarok, like the fact that they were talking about the end of the world is coming. It was very different compared to other mythologies I've known.
Yep, do it.
And it's, well, that might actually segue us eventually into the conversation about death and dying and grief.
We're on mythology and truth now.
Okay. All right, I'll rename the episode.
But there's this understanding that like truth is not just limited to literal, observable, factual truth. That is one form of truth, but there's lots of other forms of truth. And that mythology, offers cultural truths. They're subjective, for sure, and they're culturally created over time. But I think sometimes in progressive ideologies, like you would find in San Francisco or most liberal cities in the United States, there's this sort of reaction to being like, oh, that's just a fairy tale, as if like, or like those things are just culturally created. And you're like, yeah, actually there's some deep wisdom with things that are culturally created over generations. Like wisdom is passed from experience over many generations. And then in oral traditions, unlike ours, which is much more of a written tradition, in oral traditions, the wisdom of the previous ancestors are embedded in story. They're embedded in myth. And so mythology is a form of culturally constructed, culturally learned, culturally saturated truth and wisdom that is embedded into a story. And it's brilliant. Every storyteller tells the myth just a slightly different way because each wisdom keeper is accentuating different parts of the mythology that might be most relevant to the culture that day. So myth is living, vibrant, it shifts, it changes, it's adaptable for new generations. It's the people who hold those myths get to embed their own wisdom, learned, experienced, embodied wisdom into those myths as they're sharing it with the young around a fire or around a dance or in some theatrical ritual. And I find that really brilliant. I think that's a brilliant way of encapsulating generational wisdom in a way that is not written. Because when it's written, you get these semantic arguments, these literal arguments of going back to the text and squabbling about things. When like truth, much of truth, especially outside of empirical wisdom, it shifts and it's alive. Truth is living and it's breathing. It's not something that's stale and dead. There's deep wisdom in understanding that there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is understanding a set of facts, mechanics of how things work. Wisdom is embodied experience. It's having knowledge and having experience together that creates wisdom. And I think we're not short on facts. We're not short on knowledge. We live in an overly saturated world of facts and knowledge. But how to hold those takes true wisdom. And we're missing wisdom in Western civilization at the moment. And I find indigenous cultures to have a remarkable amount of it. And so I think it's a really good opportunity for us to learn if we can curb our hubris and arrogance.
I did interview Tade Zayas from Lava Love Cacao, which I think you've encountered. And his message is very much, go back to the indigenous and learn from them.
Yeah.
So that was his perspective. And of course, his roots is very much like he is from there. He is the indigenous people. And then your perspective from being the Western civilization, how do you see that happening?
How do I see Western people learning from indigenous cultures?
Yes, in a way that is balanced, that doesn't...
Appropriate.
And actually, yes, exactly that word. And what Tade Zayas said is like, appropriate away my culture, because, if I think that there's a lot of wisdom to be taken away. He's like, appropriate away, make it popular, make it, spread it out. That is the word, but I guess then it is like in kind of like a balanced way. So what I mean balanced way, it's like not in the way of escapism. So for example, using plant medicine as a way to escape from reality of your existence, like this type of ways.
Yeah, this is a big topic. I don't know if I can shortly do this one. Cultural appropriation amongst indigenous cultures.
It's not that. It's how to learn the wisdom from indigenous, given that we do live in a culture of knowledge and facts, and there is not enough wisdom. How can you see that happening and evolving into more wholesome way of being, where Western civilization can develop pockets of wisdom?
Yeah, a couple of things actually. What's coming up for me. The more time I spend in relationship with Indigenous elders and wisdom keepers, the more I'm directed to my own indigenosity. It's buried under thousands of years of civilization and culture and empire. But in every one of us, we are native to some watershed somewhere, right? So the more that I study with the Asháninka elders of the Amazon forest, the more I'm actually pointed to my own ancestors. Some were Celts in Ireland, probably some Greek or some like Southern Mediterranean tribe. And my bloodline shows that I have like Ashkenazi Judaism. So there it is. The more time I've spent in indigenous cultures that are alive today, the more I'm curious about my own ancestors who were indigenous somewhere too. There's something else that comes up too. This one's a little bit more tough. I want to say something about cultural appropriation first.
Please.
I think for me, when there's a very subtle difference between learning with and learning from indigenous cultures and expropriating indigenous cultures. One thing that's been a blessing is that like I've been connected to one family and have been traveling to the Amazon for a few years and studying with one teacher who I can actually be in relationship with. I text the son all the time. We have like a relationship. I go back to the same place. It's not me like traveling around for like a couple weeks and like picking like this little thing and this little thing. I did have my time of that, but like the more when I started to mature, and I found myself really gravitating to like, I really want to study with one person. And I think that really helps without appropriating it because you're in a relationship with that person. Another part is when you are talking and discussing is like honoring those traditions. When you're hosting a ritual of your own, a ceremony of your own, is really honoring those traditions and being very forthcoming of like, hey, I'm a student. I'm not a master here. I'm in a relationship with an elder or a family or a lineage that I'm particularly studying. It allows you to go deeper. There's also a right relationship between like how much you like the income part. Like if you're making money off of something, is a portion of that going back to support the efforts and the lineages that you're working with. It shifts from like learning from indigenous cultures to appropriating. It's sort of like you're not giving due respect, which means you're like claiming that this wisdom is your own. Exploiting with the primary purpose of making more money. If there is a clean energy exchange, there's something different between that. There was this moment, this is a little addiction or a little tangent, but there's this moment in a book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that I really enjoyed. And the author is discussing from the tribe of the Mohawk that like some of the elders, this is not, again, like uniformly held, there isn't just like one story held, but she was discussing in this chapter of the book how some of the elders of the Mohawk tribe had gathered. Do you know what's wrong with the Westerners here, like the Americans? It's they never became native. They've always adapted settler mindsets. They came as colonizers and settlers, but after 200 and some years, 400 some years of living in the United States, they've never become native. And I thought this was such a fascinating twist of like,
Hey, I'm having goosebumps.
sure, you're not gonna adorn a Mohawk and start speaking Mohawk, and that's not right relationship. It's, hey, there's a worldview, there's a value system that is culturally transcribable. To appropriate indigenous wisdoms is to take the superficial stuff, the feathers, the tomahawk, the outward appearance, and just keep it like that. True understanding is getting at the wisdom, getting at the value set and the mindset and the worldview of indigenous cultures, which you can apply by not wearing mohawks or like adorning feather dresses or being in teepees. You can do that like in your sweat clothes.
How would the person in this in sweatpants right now, maybe watching and listening to us, is there a way that is accessible that doesn't require traveling to the place, or does it always require traveling to where the indigenous tribes is? Because the space that my question is coming from is that, well, not everyone can afford it, you know?
Yeah.
Flight ticket and things like that to really learn, because once you're here in this land, and I'm just looking out of the window, this beautiful mountain outside, is there a way to make it? Is it reaching out to people who've been there? Is there a way?
Yeah. Going back to this concept of like, you can be a settler, you can be someone who becomes native. To become native means that you love the land and claim the land as your home. Not claim it as in dominance over, but relationship with and in. Law emanates from the land, that we are in relationship with the land. This is like deep indigenous worldview. It's this relationship to the land, and the land as home, the land as lover, the land as sister and brother, as grandmother and grandfather. Wherever we are, wherever we're at home, if we truly feel the river, that the waters, the soil, the air, these are our kin. If we're in a relationship with them, we tend to not treat the environment the way that we would if we have a settler mindset. If we have a settler mindset, we kind of adopt a worldview that like the world is full of dead inanimate objects. If they're dead and they have no life in them, then why shouldn't we colonize them? Why shouldn't we extract them for wealth? But indigenous cultures all over the world are varied and diverse in all of their languages and customs and ritual and tradition. But there are some unifying aspects of indigenous worldview. And one of them is like, the world is alive. The rocks are alive and they can be communicated with. The trees and the waters are alive and they're our kin. This in Aboriginal Dreamtime Walker, like cosmology, this is called the kinship system. An author is an Indigenous Australian author, Tyson Yokampora. He talks about this kinship system, and all Indigenous cultures honor this idea that we are in kinship. A kin is like your family members. That beaver and moose and raven and lion and jackal and hippopotamus, wherever you are in your context, these are people. These are equal members of your family. And that's indigenous. That's an indigenous worldview. And any one of us can adopt and learn to shift our mindset. The really hard work, it's very easy to go and be with a Navajo for a ceremony and then set up your own teepee and start banging a drum. That's very different than slowly letting your whole reality shift to a different worldview, to a different realm of reality, that we don't live in a world that is filled with dead, inanimate objects, that we live in a world of animacy, that we live 999 of your ancestors were unified around a mythology, around a story, around a belief that the world was alive and you were related to all of it. And in fact, you were the last one to show up. So you have more to learn from the animals and the plants than you do everyone else.
I hadn't thought about it that way. We were the last ones to show. I was the last one to show up.
So it's
That's
adopting.
amazing.
It's allowing that to inform your behavior, and that's the real work. This is where I don't think it's cultural appropriation. When you're sitting with elders, when you're sitting with storytellers and myth keepers of all different traditions, past, present, and you let that information and that wisdom change you, the way that you show up in the world, that is deeply enriching. And so back to the conversation of like, how do Western people learn from indigenous wisdom? Let it change you. Let it shift your reality. Let it invoke emotion in you. Let it change your behaviors. It becomes embodied that way. It's not some esoteric wisdom that you're just like keeping in a collection of things as a novel experience, but rather you're letting those experiences and that wisdom really saturate into your body and the way that you show up in the world. And it makes a huge difference. I can't tell you the difference between how I looked at the world 10 years ago and how I looked at the world today. It's just been an incredible journey. It takes a long time. And in the beginning, for most people, and I think this is where like some of our viewers can also not be so pretentious, is that
Oh, something's coming.
is that It's a normal phase, actually, to just culturally appropriate. It's kind of how it starts, because it's the very definition of it. It's superficial. You're superficially adopting things and expropriating them from cultures that you don't truly understand. My push is to be gentle with people who are doing that and push them deeper. I'm not married to this, but I think it's a necessary developmental phase of maturation. I saw it myself. 10 years ago, I was probably appropriating indigenous cultures and being like, this is so wild and cool. But then over 10 years of keeping with it and studying and letting it shift and change me, it deepens and it matures. So maybe we can be a little bit more patient with each other, as that we're undoing thousands of years of imperialism in Western civilization. We're like scratching at an old way of life. It's like an archaeologist. It takes a long time to brush back the layers of dust and dirt and bone and ash to get to the real thing.
I think there's also perhaps some fear attached to it, because I think when one gets in touch with like more indigenous ways of being and realizing and really feeling that earth and animals and rocks and everything around us is alive, then it starts dawning on you. It's like, oh my God, what have I been doing? What are we doing?
Yes,
and that
exactly.
fear overwhelms you.
Yes.
It's like, what? And then you start saying, you basically start aligning yourself with the narrative of, you know, climate breakdown.
Yeah.
And then you start feeling the pain of the earth. You start feeling the pain of nature, of the animals, of the indigenous cultures that have been suppressed for hundreds of years. I think that is the fear that also maybe in the way of people adopting and really letting that.
And that segues right back to grief. One of the major gates of grief is the sorrow of the world. And that's one of the sorrows of the world. We're facing incredible biosphere collapse. We're losing, don't quote me on this, but we're losing like 250 species a day. It's probably not great for your body and your mind to just plunge into the depths of it. And you probably can't get there, actually. I think our psyches have a natural protection mechanism that allows a gentler unraveling of what you thought was real into a new reality. Your heart probably can't take the pain, really feeling the amount of loss that we're experiencing ecologically, culturally. Things are unraveling, and they're unraveling quickly. And so like my thought is, like, as people like dabble into like plant medicines and different indigenous traditions, we should expect that there's going to be a level of superficiality with it, because it takes a while for the heart to loosen its armor. It's protected. It's protected because it doesn't want to shatter. And if you rip it off, it's like you could do more damage. The heart is tender, and it needs much time and a lot of processing and integration to slowly remove or loosen the armor that's around our heart. The armor around our heart protects it. And it was developed as a survival mechanism. And it's gonna take a while to unravel that. And it can't just be ripped off. And when it has been ripped off for some people, it's not great. Like, many people go and like don't survive. They go mad, they go crazy. They're unfunctional for years. They can't support themselves. They do a lot of harm to their families or loved ones who they're in relationship with, because all of a sudden this armor just chopped off. It's much better for the system if it just goes slower and more gentle. The heart opens like a flower. There's like Taoist texts that talk about the flowering of the heart. It has to be coaxed. There's a slowness. So much of our culture is like, I want this now. Immediate gratification. This will go into a diatribe of sometimes why I'm not like, as a plant medicine person, I give a lot of caution to people, because the Amazonian trees oftentimes just like yank shit out. And like, if you're not prepared for it, it's not like, oh, let me go have my ayahuasca experience. It will be great, right? The flyers of the ayahuasca that you see around Pisac are like, get in touch with your goddess. It's all love and light, and you'll experience the oneness of consciousness. That might be a lot to handle in the beginning. If you're coming from San Francisco in corporate banking and technology, and then you're down in Peru and you're like, let me see my inner goddess, you might not be ready for your inner goddess. There's a reason why in Greek mythology, and all the mythologies, when you encounter the gods, they tend to hide their face in shadow. And only in some myths, like the myth of Smyrna, Dionysus' mother, she wants to see the face of Zeus. But when she does, she's ignited in fire and she dies. There's something about the divine experience that you might not be able to actually handle it. There might be a reason and a wisdom of why the gods hide their face in shadow and only reveal themselves in subtleties and through mythology and through symbols and archetypal imagery. So I think we should be a little bit more careful of trying to I want to see the face of God.
At some point, maybe later on, you can tell me if you've experienced that.
Yeah, totally. I tried to blow the casket open. I'm I want my heart open now. And I didn't realize an open heart meant a broken heart. I didn't understand what that level of grief would unfold. I didn't know what was behind the armor. And it was only when I tried to smash the armor open, I went into a state. I've never been depressed. And I got back from my first diet. I was crushed for a year and a half to 2 years. I barely could hold a job. I've always been super productive. I've always been very with it. I've always been very dutiful and responsible. And all of a sudden, I didn't have any of those protections. They were gone. And I got back and I didn't know how to be. I was losing my identity. It's this process that Carl Jung describes in his Red Book, it was only released in 2010. And only years, I think he died in the 60s, only 40 years after his postmortem, he never wanted his journals to be published. A scholar finally got his family to release the books because literally anyone who read those books, he's clinically insane. They would have pathologized him. They would have labeled him schizophrenic. They would have labeled him dissociative personality traits. And in many ways, I experienced a lot of those. I'm certain that if I went to a psychologist at that point, I would just tell them my symptoms and they would be this pathology, this pathology, this pathology, this medication, this medication, this medication. And some grand gesture of grace allowed me to understand cognitively that this experience was quite different, that this wasn't insanity, that this isn't a pathology, it's the way that the heart opens. And there's a natural process in which people do lose their identities. But unfortunately, we're so hell-bent in a Western world of being functional all the time, because that's what's good for the economy, that there's not a lot of room to be unfunctional. And we try to medicate our way out of it. We try to suppress the grief. We try to medicate the grief or drown the grief out in some other way, distraction. But allowing the grief to unravel you. I think it was Francis Willer. He talks about this idea of derangement, that to be rearranged, you have to become deranged first. You have to become out of order first. But we're so feverish about keeping ourselves intact. It's the very thing that is creating dis-ease in our bodies that eventually, I believe, metastasizes to full-blown physical and psychological ailment. But in order to get into a whole, and in order to get into a system of wholeness, you have to be undone first. And we don't have a lot of space for it in the Western world. And this is the exact process that Carl Jung went on. In his Red Book, he accounts of literally, he's a psychologist. He knows what other people have said, and he very much details his inner world as an experiment of sorts. And I don't know how long he was in the stage for, but it was some time. It was more 10 years.
In that space of so-called insanity, but a lot for
it's this profound
coming apart. I like that word a lot more.
Yeah.
You need to come apart to see how the pieces come together so you can fit them in the way that they're always supposed to be.
Eco-psychologist Bill Plotkins would describe this phenomenon as the descent into the soul. In every person, there's a capacity to go into dissolution of the ego. And we're not talking about ego death in a lot of the ways that acid heads talk about like, oh man, I went on acid and my ego died. We're talking about a very long, arduous process of your ego unraveling. And it doesn't die. Well, in many ways it does die, but it matures is a better kind of way of saying it. This is actually a good segue into grief as well too.
Okay. You've reached the end of part 1 of the 3-part series of On Emergence podcast on sorrow and grief, where I interviewed Zach Siegel. Tune in next week to discover and dive in further and darker in ego maturation and imagination. In a week after that, we're going to discuss 5 gates of grief. I hope to see you in the weeks to come. Don't forget to subscribe, hit that like button, forward this episode if it resonated with you or if you think someone can benefit from it. And as always, I'll be very excited to hear from you, to any questions, any requests that you might have when it comes to this specific episode or the rest of the show. Thank you. As always, I'm Lori Sagan, your host and a fellow human being.